as you want. I'm ready anyway.
I'm ready too.
Let's do it.
Okay, great. Over to you.
Okay, so I guess I have to press here, but it doesn't work. Now, yes. Who you did it, Alice, or myself?
No, you're in control. But let me know if you want me to do it, and we can change that.
Yeah, because it's okay. Okay, so do I have to introduce myself and so forth, or we go directly?
Yeah, please. If you could all introduce yourselves, actually, I think that would be very helpful.
Fine. So my name is Manuel Sanchez Montero. I'm director of advocacy in Madrid Action Against Hunger's headquarters. And we are also with our colleagues, Michelle Brown, Advocacy Director in Action Against Hunger US, and Pauline Chetcoty, Humanitarian Advocacy Responsible in Paris. Well, the thing that we want to tell today is about the Hunger and Conflict Project, which is one of the international initiatives that we are putting up among the network. And I would like to start by introducing a little bit what are the reasons why this project rose up and which are the challenges and opportunities that we have detected. So the first thing is that probably all of you know about the 4 famines alarm, the situation that 2 years ago took place and was quite relevant in the international community, drawing attention from mainly not only humanitarian players, which is normally the case, but also political players. A lot of member states, regional organizations were putting attention on South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, and Ethiopia, where huge numbers of people were affected by hunger crisis, acute hunger crisis, and all of them related to a lot of with a lot of links with the violence and warfare that was taking place in the Horn of Africa. This was interpreted by Action Against Hunger, our international network, as one of the main issues having impact on our operations, which were precisely the increase of problems of access to and from victims to the aid, the degradation of the quality of funding, which has been parallelly being progressively conditioned by the security agenda, by an urgentist approach, and not new, but suffering from even more acute problems of not timeliness, so late and insufficient donor response to those crises. Plus also, another challenge that has been arisen in those years, it's that the resilience preventive approach that has been discussed for years appeared to have much more ears, much more attention, and of course is much more, is not much more, but is very relevant and absolutely relevant in this kind of crisis. So in order to attend to work more properly in those food insecure situations, the resilience and preventive approach is coming up as a major opportunity that this process of alarm of the 4 famines is raising up some momentum too. Then I would like just to introduce that there are some let's say work streams, initiatives that have been taking place during the last months. Even years, the last 2 years. One is the Famine Action Mechanism, let's say promoted by the World Bank, very much focused on the resilience and preventive way of mobilizing resources and drawing even political attention on those contexts where food security is identified as a key factor for conflict. That initiative is intending to put around a pool of donors and funding that might have the capacity to be mobilized in rapidly with this resilience approach, not only thinking about the emergency response, trying to be more linked with other development tools from the very same donors. So it's enjoying quite a lot of political attention from some of those main donors, among them the British, but also the World Bank, a major player which is getting inside of the humanitarian arena in the last years. Then the UN Security Council Resolution 2417, which is basically working on breaking the cycle between conflict and hunger and vice versa. Hosted in the UN Security Council, where some member states, precisely the Netherlands, but also supported by Sweden, by Switzerland, now Germany stepping in, and enjoying quite a significant support by some of the main humanitarian players, so WFP, ICRC accompanying, and to recognize our excellent job done by the New York office, citing and supporting this initiative and accompanying it. So the resolution is a reality, is now a kind of political agreement that hunger should be prohibited as a war weapon, that we should invest properly in advance in order to prevent that food insecurity fosters violence, and that the response to the crisis should be responsible enough in order to work again in this kind of preventive factor. So having good food security response might foster peace and stabilization in the future. And then the UN's integrated approach / the European Union Triple Nexus, so this kind of whole of government approach that has been developed in the last already decade, and is very much capitalized or led by the UN Secretary General and the European Union External Action Service, so the Vice Presidency of the European Union, which are two of the major players which are putting into action this way of putting all the means, that implies not only diplomatic and security, but also aid means, at the service of the stabilization and security agenda. This is a very controversial issue. It's an issue that we don't have the choice to discuss or not, because in fact in many of the countries where there is violence, either if there are integrated UN integrated missions or not, we are suffering already this kind of melting pot of conditioning of the agenda, not only in terms of funding, but even in terms of having appropriate access, because of the confusion of the actions undertaken by security policies, because of the conditioning of the access to get securitization of the areas and the populations where we intend to work. So it's having massive implications on our work. We'll try to pass, yes. So then there are, following this, there are like three major objectives that we have been identifying. One is to try to work for the mobilization of resources on food and nutrition specific and sensitive in advance. So that's very much related with the FAM. By contributing to building the early warning mechanism, but also trying to advocate for multi-year flexible funding tools and, of course, needs-based tools. There we are joining a number of partners, among them the UK government, DFID, UNICEF, the WFP, and also Oxfam. So those are the kind of stakeholders, allies, that we are working together into this environment. Of course, with the World Bank, which is not in the science there. Then the implementation of the 24/17 UN Security Council resolution. This is the mandate that the Security Council has given itself, is to foster and to put into motion that resolution, so to make it happen. Long process that has started by drafting and starting to look after getting an early warning mechanism that might trigger not only financial but also political response. And that's the second point where we think we're going to have a very probably long-term, but we need to be persistent, outcome to get, which is to try to put forward a way that political response to actions impeding humanitarian aid or impacting food security, that implies actions, violent actions, impacting directly livelihoods or other sources of food security, should be taken into motion by the UN Security Council, regional bodies, or other stakeholders. Here again, we are a small player within very big players. So the UK government, the Netherlands, which is the main promoter, Sweden, Switzerland, Germany, WFP, FAO, ICRC working also very silently, but also following it up. And here we appear to be in the group of friends of the 24/17 resolution as by the moment, if I'm not mistaken, the only NGO working consistently on that. And then the third objective, which is the definition and implementation of a tribal nexus and integrated approach. So here, basically, what we are trying to put up also is a position that we might defend towards some specific targets. So that would be the UN Secretary General and the European Commission, with some member states between blockers like France, swingers like Germany, or let's say not champions, but quite close to our positions like the Swedes, in order to promote a more humanitarian respectful, humanitarian sensitive response, in order to work also in fostering and putting our way of working with a more conflict sensitive approach, and trying to get more balanced coordination mechanism where the humanitarian agenda should be dealt in a more symmetric, in a more effective way, to foster humanitarian response based on needs and respecting the humanitarian principles. I would like to run a little bit, not I'm going to get all the time. So approach and key players, that's what we said before. There are some players, depending on the niche of intervention that we are identifying. So there's a gap which is apparently to be, so where collaboration contribution from our organization would be very welcome. It's in the evidence of the, so to try to promote a methodology and a way to get evidence for the early warning mechanism in the FAM, but also for the 2417 resolution. There's also a contribution that we think we can provide by shaping food crisis preventive funding and policies. Also, precisely the shape of food crisis emergency funding directly, support the setup of coordination mechanism, and shape resilient and flexible programming. For that, definitely, this is a task which is multi-sectorial. It's something that advocacy itself will never be able to attain. So that's something that requires absolutely the big implication from technical and operations departments on the strong evidence-based analysis, both departments doing the active participation in key fora, both departments in strategic alliances with key stakeholders, where we are really being a massive implementing partner. So some of them might be specific allies, and we have to take advantage of the traction of the already confidence built with those stakeholders, like the European Commission or like the UN system, and attractive communication campaigns with key audiences where communications is going to be also instrumental. So I has to talk about the action plan, which is still a work in progress, but we are in a process of getting the niche identification and negotiation of the niche where we can participate around the different reports and mechanism of information which are getting built up, like the global report on food crisis that was issued 2 days ago, like the FAM or from the World Bank. So this is the first phase where for the next 4 months we would be working at. Then we have the active participation in key fora. We already participated in the Global Food Network Against Food Crisis with Pauline Chepkuti making our points in a panel precisely on the implementation of the 2417 resolution, the G7 or the UN Security Council different venues. We are supposed also to work in getting case studies and analysis on specific countries or contexts where this is a is an issue of great priority, like Nigeria, Central African Republic, which are 2 reports which are already produced. But also we are working on the Yemen, Syria, Mali, South Sudan. So we are being a bit indulgent with ourselves because we don't have so much resources, so we're going for 12 months ahead. Probably we will need to, if we want to shorten that, we'll need to get more resources in. And then the definition of a political response mechanism with the different players, UN system, but also the key identified states, something that probably will have to work parallelly, but will be more relevant after the early warning definition will be on. I would finish here, and I would pass then the hand to Michelle to go on with the UN process for hunger and conflict.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Also, you're now in control of the PowerPoint, if that's...
Okay, great, thanks. So I will just speak very briefly from where I sit in New York about how the Security Council is moving Resolution 2417 forward. So as Manuel mentioned, about, I guess, 11 months ago now, the Security Council passed this resolution which recognized conflict and hunger as an issue of international peace and security, much to everyone's surprise. It was really, it was doubtful when the Swedes and the Dutch started talking about this process that a resolution would pass, because it really expanded how the Security Council engaged on what many believed to be a purely humanitarian issue. But they were able to make the case that these grave violations of international humanitarian law, these war crimes, actually were a political issue and demanded a political response. And I think it fed into the global developments in terms of, really growing rates of food insecurity, growing rates of undernutrition, and a reversal in decades of progress of decreasing numbers of people who are food insecure. So I think the timing of this resolution was right. So Action Against Hunger had worked for, 2 years previous to the passage of this resolution to really mobilize political support. So we got the resolution, and now the difficult piece is on us in terms of how we want to push for the implementation. But there have been some developments. So Manuel had mentioned that one of the key parts of Resolution 2417 was early warning. So basically the Security Council said that when contexts were at risk of deteriorating into famine because of conflict-related food insecurity, the Secretary General would alert the Security Council to these situations. The resolution in and of itself was not very prescriptive about how this would happen, so it was up to the UN system to work it out. So OCHA took the lead on this. So in July last year, they developed this practice of writing white papers that could be delivered to the Security Council, alerting them to situations in which conflict-related food insecurity was deteriorating. So South Sudan was the first such white paper, and then about 4 months later, Yemen was the second white paper. And the first white paper, in the case of South Sudan, wasn't super useful. It was very descriptive, didn't really offer any recommendations. But the Yemen white paper was actually quite useful, outlined 5 key asks for the Security Council, and they're asks which we as civil society can then hold Security Council members accountable for. And what we're finding now within this context is that it's very difficult now to hold council members accountable to this because there's no follow-up reporting. We've been pushing OCHA and WFP to maybe deliver 6 monthly progress reports. Once the Security Council has been given an early warning activation, then what happens 6 months on? Because actually, if you look at the IPC figures in South Sudan, they are stable and deteriorating in some contexts, in some of the areas within South Sudan. And for Yemen, the situation has not improved. So we're continually working with OCHA. In South Sudan, they were not interested in presenting a white paper, a progress report to the Security Council. In the case of Yemen, they might be. So hopefully we'll have something that in concrete terms that we can present to the Council to show how 2417 has been used. The second kind of stream of work that we're looking at is around the protection of civilians agenda. So given the resolution's focus on violations of international humanitarian law, access constraints, starvation as a weapon of war, it does fit within the protection of civilians agenda. So at New York level, there's a group of Friends of Protection of Civilians. So it's friendly member states who are very pro protection of civilians, and a separate work stream on the resolution has been set up. They've met once, and the idea is that they'll meet on a quarterly basis, and we can use this group to sustain political momentum in terms of implementation of the resolution. I think that there is a growing recognition that counterterrorism and sanctions are impeding the work of humanitarians across the board, but I think it will be possible to really show how these restrictions are constraining how we deliver assistance in contexts where conflict-related food insecurity is an issue. So there was a resolution that was recently passed. The French drafted it, civil society globally mobilized around it, and I think we can live with the resolution. Basically is status quo. It doesn't really improve how we're able to operate, but I don't think it causes any major problems for us. But in this process, I think friendly member state governments really have started to understand the difficulties we're having. So we'll continue those discussions within their group of friends of POC and with friendly member states, looking at the unintended consequences of sanctions and counterterrorism restrictions on how we're able to respond in situations where 24/17 is relevant. And then the French and the Germans, I guess on Monday, introduced the idea of a call to action around humanitarian assistance. And I mean, I think as a network, we haven't really discussed how we want to engage on this, but it could be an interesting entree into highlighting how 24/17 can be implemented to improve humanitarian action in contexts in which conflict-related food insecurity is an issue. I think one of the other things that's come out of the resolution is 6 monthly reporting by World Food Program and WFP. So WFP basically just takes IPC data and presents specific context to the Security Council, maybe as a precursor to early warning. So the last report was presented in January, and it covered Afghanistan, CAR, DRC, Lake Chad Basin, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. So I think that in terms of an early warning tool, it will be interesting for us to continue to work with WFP and FAO on this. And if we believe that there's a context that warrants early action by the Security Council, we can actually make the case to the Secretary General ourselves. Nothing will stop us from doing that. If we think that the Emergency Relief Coordinator and that OCHA isn't responding in an effective manner. And lastly, I just want to raise in terms of our actions, we're planning a side event around the anniversary of Resolution 24/17, so bringing in a variety of different civil society actors to show how we collectively are engaging on 24/17 and how it has or hasn't enhanced our work. There's an interesting discussion that's happening at New York level around sanctions regimes. So when a sanctions regime is set up, then a panel of experts is appointed to investigate different crimes that would lead to sanctions. So in the case of Yemen, 24/17 is being discussed as a way to gather evidence on starvation as a weapon of war in the case of Yemen, so that potentially sanctions can be imposed on individuals who have knowingly supported starvation as a weapon of war as a tactic. So that's it from my end, and I look forward to questions. So Alice?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, did Pauline have a section?
Exactly. So
Okay, great. I'll just give you control of the presentation. Okay, there you go. You're in control.
Yeah. Thank you. Am I?
If you just click your right or left arrows on your keyboard, you should be able to change the.
No.
All right. I'm not sure.
No,
Let me.
I don't have it. I'm very sorry for that.
That's okay.
Yeah. There you go. Hi. So a few questions to complement what has been presented by Michelle earlier, and to come back on a few things that could be interesting in looking into in terms of challenges that this resolution may bring. So as Michelle really very rightly described, there are a few challenges that are quite sensitive and high level that we'll have to take into account when operating and delivering our strategic plan. The question of the politically sensitive matter of the resolution, because we're talking about implementing a resolution that is after all about access, about conflict, and about state sovereignty and how they conduct hostilities, and on the one hand, and accountability for crimes on the other. Obviously, we're facing there a challenge of implementation of Security Council resolutions that imply a willingness of the states involved in a given conflict to act on their allies or on their own conduct of hostilities. And this is not always something that is very easy to do, as we can see in the case of Yemen, for example, where for this case we've been doing quite a lot of advocacy towards the French state and the UK state, who have been indirectly involved in the coalition playing in the Yemen, and using very clearly the argument of hunger being used as a weapon there, and the critical humanitarian situation in the Yemen, and how this can, the whole population being 80% of the population being dependent on humanitarian aid, and yet it's very difficult to see them upholding their obligations in terms of how the hostilities are being conducted. So we have there a difficulty between the reality on the ground as we see it and accountability for crimes. Also, to enter a little bit of the legal framework discussion, we have to remind that we're talking mostly when conflicts arise about IHL, International Humanitarian Law. International Humanitarian Law is an international legal framework, which means that there is no national or international enforcement mechanism that would impose enforcement of this law on the different actors, and it is then down to the different actors to ensure that they are abiding by the law. So this is something that has always been a challenge, and still currently is, in terms of implementation of this resolution. So as I'm talking about IHL, we can also ask, is IHL, International Humanitarian Law, really applicable with regard to the 2417, and what does the law really say? For clarification, both international humanitarian law and international criminal law both prohibit, and humanitarian, both international human rights law prohibit the crime of starvation during times of war and peace, and is interpreted, this crime, as the action of deliberately starving or subjected to famine a civilian population. So we can talk about this in situations such as targeting of objects indispensable for the survival of the population, such as foodstuff, crops, livestock, or drinking water installations. Or, as it's also the case for 2417, the impediment of relief supplies intended to reach the civilian population. It can obviously also happen during, in context of siege or blockades, such as in Syria or in Yemen, or in other countries, or in Nigeria, where we can see that access to services is impeded. So we have examples of of hunger being used as a weapon in many different situations. However, these situations are often internal conflicts, what we call non-international armed conflict. Unfortunately, international criminal law, so the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, does not prohibit hunger as a weapon in non-international armed conflicts, only in conflicts between two states, which is unfortunately a very, very small number of the conflicts that we are witnessing today. So one question that arises as well in terms of advocacy and how to implement 24/17 and all the legal parts of it is how to ensure that starvation as a crime would be recognized in internal conflicts, which would need an amendment of the Rome Statute and quite a lot of collective actions towards that. As ACF, this position has not been developed yet on whether this is something that we will push forward, but this is definitely something that we need to look into as it's an identified issue to address. And also, as Michel and Manuel have really already explained, there are a few challenges with regard to the tools that we can use to ensure implementation of this resolution. So we've talked about the sanctions. So the good thing is that by passing this resolution, the Security Council has recognized that the use of hunger as a tactic of war is exacerbate armed conflict and is an issue for peace and security around the world, which give the Security Council the possibility to take extraordinary measures such as sanctions. This could be one way to have very smart and targeted actions towards a few perpetrators rather than having too large sanctions that could negatively impact civilian populations. So that would be one way to have targeted, smart sanctions aimed at key sectors, key economic sectors, or key individuals. That would definitely be an incentive to stop certain conflicts, certain conducts, to change behavior, and to increase the cost of using hunger as a weapon. However, to have sanctions, you would have to have the agreement of the Security Council, and politically this is something that will be very challenging in the current context. Lastly, and again, I think Michel already touched it quite a lot, and I think it's something that we will have to look at in terms of how we develop and roll out our advocacy, is the roles of the different UN mechanisms, such as the IPC, the role of the ERC, OCHA, compared to WFP and FAO, and the role of the FAM as an early action mechanism. I think Michel described very well how the ERC and the different monthly reports, 6 monthly reports, are being used. And we have to play very sensibly between the different agencies to ensure that we have a coherent and collective actions of the whole UN system with regard to the implementation of 24/17, and that the different mandates of the different UN agencies are not hindering implementation of the resolution. And I will be happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, all of you. Does anybody have any questions? I guess we'll take that as a no. But thank you so much for such an interesting session. As I mentioned, we have recorded it, so it will go up on the Knowledge Hub. I'll share the link around with all of you so you can share it with your networks if you'd like to. And yeah, I think that was actually our last webinar of Learning Week, so thank you so much for participating. And I might be following up with you later to just follow up on some of these things and disseminating it a little bit further.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.